Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone.
Welcome back to Hope Blooms. I am Maria Servold, EPLA's president.
And I am Stephanie Gordon, an EPLA board member.
And today we have with us Abby Strehle, who is a supporter and friend of EPLA and recently became our treasurer. So welcome, Abby.
Hello. It's nice to be here.
And Abby is going to today share her loss story. So we'll sort of jump in with questions here and there, but you may as well just sort of start from the beginning.
I will. So my husband and I had been married for a couple of years, and the first positive pregnancy test is one that we can all remember very well and was absolutely everything that everyone says it is. And we were incredibly excited, and it felt like it had taken forever to get there. It really hadn't, but there was a lot of excitement around it. And it's true that when people say that they see the line, you are a mom, and it is true. I don't know, everything about what color the nursery is going to be, all of it does flash before your eyes, and it did with me. I didn't have a lot of anxiety in that moment. I was just really excited. So my experience with miscarriage and loss before having one myself actually was kind of broad in the sense of I was very aware of it. I had had several friends who had had losses and were very transparent about how they felt and what had happened. So that, I think, it was a benefit, and it was also something that has marked my experience from the very beginning, even, after the joy of that first, seeing the first test. So I was very concerned after a couple of days about, okay, we're in the very, beginning of this pregnancy. I know what the statistics are. I was very familiar with that. So I was very worried. And I was only about a week and a half into my pregnancy, and I experienced some bleeding. And everyone says a little bit is, common. So I tried to be reassured by that. And
it's like the most, one of those... It's not a myth. Like, it does happen, but I feel like for most people, when it happens, it's not a good thing. I don't know. It's like I did the same thing. I clung to that for 12 hours until it was clearly not that. But
yes. And my story is such a funny one because, I was terrified that that's what was happening. So after about 24 hours of it becoming a little bit more substantial, my husband and I went into the ER. I remember very clearly that it was like exactly 7 p.m. when we walked in. It was later than 2:30 in the morning when we walked out. But I was diagnosed in the ER with a subchorionic hematoma and was told that everything was fine. Which I remember lying in the bed. It was like by the time that we got the news that was the source of my bleeding, I had been probably about 4 hours into my experience in the ER. So I was just I remember laying on the bed and just being frozen, thinking, okay, I'm having a miscarriage. I just wish someone would come and tell me that that's what's going on. I just wanted to know whether or not that was the case. So when the ER doc just poked his head in super quick and was like, oh, it's a bleed. We can see this fetal sac in the pool. Everything looks great for right now. I remember being incredibly relieved. I did not care that it was 1:00 in the morning and that we had been there for so long. I was like, okay, I don't even care about the ER bill. It's perfectly fine.
Abby, can you maybe explain what that is for those who might not know?
It's a general source of first trimester bleeding. It's essentially where a portion of your uterine wall has detached. Not as if, you are, having a miscarriage, but it's a very common thing that happens. Most often it is reabsorbed during the pregnancy. So it is something that can complicate early pregnancy, but it does not mean that you're necessarily going to have a loss or any sort of complication from it. So I was very relieved. I remember coming home and my poor husband was exhausted, but I was elated at that point because I was so stressed out about it. And he thought, it was just much more even keeled, like it will be okay unless we have bad information. But I had already, really thought that we were going to have a loss. And I remember very distinctly going into the OB ward a couple days later to get my ROCAM shot, which, is something that you need if you have negative blood. And even if you are very early on and have a bleed. And I remember seeing my OB after I was coming back from the shot. And I said, gosh, I was so worried about this. And he said, he's like, there's basically no indication of whether or not you're going to have a loss. And I remember standing there and asking him, will I know when I'm having a miscarriage? Because that's what I was truly so concerned about in that moment, because I was just having bleeding. I wasn't having pain. I wasn't, seeing anything that was alarming other than the bleed. And he turned to me and he said, yes, you will know if it is happening. And I thought, okay, I can at least have some comfort in knowing. I just was so anxious about it. So fast forward, that was about 5.5 weeks. So I knew I was pregnant for about a week and a half. I went to the 8-week appointment. My husband and I both saw the heartbeat for the first time. That was amazing. And I remember very distinctly the ultrasound tech, the labeling, what was what. And she was labeling the baby and she misspelled it, and she spelled it BASBY. And so my husband and I were like, it's Basby. And we just had this such a fun moment. And I literally said to him, again, just like the first test, I said to him, this is as cool as everybody says it is. It was just amazing. And I felt so much relief. I thought, okay, I've made it to 8 weeks after all of that bleeding. I have a heartbeat. This is just so wonderful.
Did the bleeding continue during that time, or did it slow?
It slowed. I would say my bleed lasted about 3 or 4 days, I would say. It was not anything crazy. Women can experience much more or less, as I understand it. So, yeah. We were very elated. I, of course, had my next 12-week appointment scheduled. And at that point in time, because, again, I was so aware of loss, I hadn't really, rushed out to do all of the first time, things. And obviously, it's still very early, but, most people would go out and buy an outfit already. I hadn't done that yet. I was still too nervous. And it was after that appointment that I was like, okay, I'm going to pull up a registry. I'm going to do the things. And I was planning on my 12-week appointment with so much excitement. And they called me, actually, the doctor's office, just a day before my appointment. And they said, we have an early opening. Do you want to come in? And I said, oh, yeah, of course I would. So my husband wasn't planning on coming with me to the appointment. I thought, I'll just run in and, we'll do what we need to do. I knew that it was pretty standard. So I rush over from work, and the office was very busy that day. And I sat there for my appointment. And I think it was I probably waited around like an hour and a half before my appointment time. And it was at the very end of the day. And the OB came in and she did the initial consult or whatever. And I could tell something was a little off. I knew from several friends that the Doppler was at the 12 weeks is not necessarily the most accurate thing, and that you can sometimes not get a read. She didn't get a read. And I thought, it's okay. Actually, I was like, oh, I'll at least get to see him again on ultrasound. That would be so nice. And she said, okay, wait here. We're super busy, but I'll go in and do the ultrasound. The ultrasound tech had left for the day. And by the time that they brought me into the ultrasound room, I could tell that I was literally the only patient left in the building. And she walked me in, and we sat down, and the OB was doing the ultrasound. And I remember that I glanced over at the screen, and I remember thinking, I don't think that looks like the way it's supposed to. And she took quite a few moments, as they always do when they're doing these types of ultrasounds. And she did turn to me and she's like, I have news for you, and it's not going to be very good, but you have to give me a couple more minutes. I have to be sure of all of that I'm looking at. And I was there alone, of course, which was the worst part. And we can go into that later. I don't do those types of appointments at all alone now, at all, regardless of what it is. And we sat there, and I didn't cry. I didn't do anything. I just sat there and thought, this is exactly what I was afraid of. It wasn't a foreign concept to me. And the funny thing that came back to me was, I was so obsessed with knowing whether or not it was going to happen, and I had a missed miscarriage, which of course, as we all know, is when, there is no
happening
and you don't know what's happening.
Right.
And, it's only diagnosable by ultrasound. And I must have been aware that miscarriage was a thing, but it just hadn't crossed my mind because I had had the bleed, I had known so many experiences that weren't that way. And it was so odd to have gone through all of that. And then for them to say, oh, no, actually, from the best thing that we can tell is that the baby passed away a day or two after your ultrasound at 8 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And at that point, I was essentially 12. And it was,
Wow.
it was the most surreal thing. Most people have that moment of, I'm sorry, there's no heartbeat. And it was like, that was all there. And I remember that phone call to my husband was the worst thing that I've experienced to date. Yeah, getting choked up thinking about it. And thankfully the staff was so wonderful. But I just remember driving home, and I don't remember driving home, quite frankly. I don't,
You did it.
I know I did it, but I just remember sobbing the entire way. And I got home and we sobbed more and more and more. And I will say that, in a sense, though, my whole experience with that, as far as the journey through the pregnancy and then through the actual loss, I am an EPLA success story, if you will. Because one of our board members that I knew immediately texted me once, she had figured out what was going on. And I was the benefit of one of our large kits in time.
Good.
All of those things, that, we strive to do. I was exactly the person who got everything on time and, in the way that I should have. So, our sort of slogan is no one suffers miscarriage alone. I suffered miscarriage and I still suffer miscarriage very, very acutely, but I did not do it alone. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. The physical experience was awful. I'm very grateful that I didn't have to do it sitting in the ER, knowing what that experience was, thinking about the way that had happened when I wasn't having a loss. But I remember, so much of it, I was not actually able to retrieve remains, which was probably the worst part in the next couple of months is just not having anything, and it still is. It's just, there's something about it because it, quite frankly, I mean, I don't mean to be gory or anything, but the baby had just decomposed too much, so there wasn't anything to retrieve necessarily.
I wasn't able to either because it was like before. I think it was probably, well, who knows, but it was happening at home and in the ER, and it was like not on anyone's mind to think about doing that. This was also 2012. I don't know.
Yeah, same.
Things have changed.
Mine was very similar to that, as in, like, I went in at 10 weeks and then, at 12 weeks, it's, So,
And it's something that, I distinctly remember, thankfully, I remember I was essentially induced to,
I was going to ask, did they give you a...
Yes.
They did. They did. And it thankfully that I had, I hate to say that, but I had a good experience with it. It did what it needed to do in the sense of I didn't have any complications. And I remember the doctor telling me that, I was a good candidate for this because I had a support system at home.
Oh, wow.
And that the thought rushed through my mind, I cannot imagine doing that
without
that support system. And I remember the next day, I was sitting on the couch, and of course I had been, obviously very upset, and all of us had been. But I remember distinctly just sobbing because, again, that lack of having anything to hold, that just, I was so obsessed with the fact that I didn't have anything to show, to hold, to do with anything. And I remember sitting on the couch the next day, and I remember sobbing and just being like, I just wanted to hold my baby. And it's such a difficult thing with loss at that early stage. You don't have much. So I'm very grateful to the many people who encouraged me to find memorial items, to do something in honor of him. And of course, we didn't know the gender or anything, but we did gender him, and his name is Jacob, which is my husband's middle name, which is a good sense of connection, you know. And I was very much encouraged by one of our fellow board members to do that, and that was incredibly helpful for me. But I will say it's marked my entire experience with pregnancy and everything. And, you know, I've just recently had the blessing of being able to give birth in a hospital setting, you know, and have a joyous outcome. But yeah, it's all been marked by my loss. It was my first pregnancy. And I know we can all, I think, at the table say that. It's just, it's a vastly... It's like
suddenly there's a cloud over everything.
It's a vastly different
just
experience.
Like the questions, like, can I carry a pregnancy to term? Like, that was my biggest fear, you know, having it be my...
Yep, me too.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, and like, because it didn't take us long to conceive that first one, but then it was a loss, and then the next one took like a year to conceive. So I just thought, I'm never gonna be able to do it. And now I have 4 live children, but in those months that feel like years, you know.
Yes, I very, very much, and I still feel that in that sense very much. I'm kind of in shock that, you know, I do have, you know, a baby at home currently. It's something that I think, and as someone too, I mean, it's a separate subject, but it has tied in very much to my loss in that sense of just wondering if your body can do it. And I ended up being diagnosed with a lot of little small things that ended up to infertility, you know? So there's a lot of things that you just don't realize, you know, that having that loss, you know, it affects everything. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want anyone to have one ever.
No.
But when it's before any live pregnant, you know, live births, it feels especially hard. What sort of things have you done to memorialize?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I crave a place in a cemetery, quite honestly, which is very exciting for us having now, you know, I think moving toward having a place where we can memorialize our children that are lost here in Hillsdale soon. But I have been given a lot of, like, honestly, little trinkets. I have a little angel that hangs from my window at home. A friend of mine who has also experienced several losses just gave me a little figurine of a boy holding a balloon, and the balloon says hope on it. There's a lot of things. My in-laws actually gave us, you know, a little memorial box full of memorial items and things like that.
Nice.
Yeah, there's a lot of things, including, you know, the blanket from our kits that it does mean a lot, you know, and just to have something. So honestly, trinkets have been really helpful for me because I can just see them around the house, you know.
Right.
And I think, I don't know, I struggled with the idea of a tree or something like that. I don't know. I couldn't find anything that worked for me. So having little things with me has been much more helpful than just, it felt so momentous. And I thought, well, honestly, what I want actually is a graveside. And I can't have that. So I don't know. I struggled. It was a little funny that way. I struggled to do anything else that was very physical, permanent.
Yeah, that's
in that
interesting.
Sense. But yeah, figurines have been incredibly helpful for me.
Well, it's fun to, not fun, but helpful to just have little things around the house that, like you said, can sort of catch your eye. Yeah. We have this one little knitted blanket that my mom made that's like a little baby blanket that she made for that first one. And weirdly, she used like rainbow colored yarn, like just because we, you know, like pastel rainbow colors, which is just interesting, you know, that was for that baby. And the girls sometimes ask, you know, whose blanket is this? Whose blanket is this? And I say, well, that was the first baby, you know, so that's, we just call it first baby.
Yes.
But yeah, they play with it all the time and stuff. So that's sort of fun.
Yeah. So we did the tree. Yeah. I actually should say my husband did the tree because he gifted it to me for Mother's Day in honor. But it is a kind of a permanent thing, right?
Yes.
And so we decided to sell our house, but the tree was already planted.
Yes, that's what I was afraid of.
Yes. I was like, okay, well, it's not that big yet. So there is a local landscaping company here who, they were wonderful. I said, the baby is buried in a box underneath this tree.
Yep.
And they were so careful to just help get everything. And so now the tree is flourishing at our house that we've been in for 8 years. But I'm like, Matt, we can't move now.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
I'm like,
We're bringing the tree with us.
I don't know how that's going to happen, but
If we go to an apartment, the tree is coming with us.
yeah.
Yep. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think, and it's so strange, and I'm so glad to hear that, because that was why I couldn't do the tree.
Yeah. Right.
And I think it's because I didn't want to experience the loss of something that I had already to me was just sort of this not a sad placeholder, because obviously we need these placeholders and they are incredibly important, but for something that I already, I couldn't hold my baby anyway. I don't want to lose the item that that is in replacement.
Yes.
It's just
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you bring up that permanence feeling, because and that was one of the first things we ever talked about a lot with like the blog, is that miscarriage is death, right?
Yes.
Like there is death of a person, and so you sort of had that draw for a grave, right? And because a lot of people would just say, oh, it's not really anything yet, it's like, no, it's a person. That's really interesting.
And I don't know, a lot of people will say this, and I will chime in and always reinforce that the best thing that you can do for someone experiencing a loss is to reassure them that they are experiencing a loss and it is a death, and acknowledging that grief and the fact that a life has been lost is the most helpful thing that anyone did for me, was just to acknowledge that it was incredibly sad and grievous, as opposed to, just thinking, well, it's, you can have another one, you're so young, and all of the things that everyone tells you.
Yes.
Yeah, I lied to people about why I was gone from work. I mean, like my boss knew why, but my students thought I had a cold or whatever, the flu or something, because I didn't want them to. I would change that now. Were it to happen again, I would tell the truth. But at the time, I was not ready, or didn't have the words, and then that sort of made it feel less significant.
Yes.
So anyway, we've come a long way since then.
Yes. Oh, yes, very much so. And again, of course, as far as hospital staff and, things that, well-meaning family and friends will say, of course you always experience those. But my experience is vastly different than, 10, 20, 30 years ago. A lot of the way people talk about it, it's like, no, I was incredibly aware of resources that were available, and it made things a whole lot easier, because I just, a couple people would come up to me and, and speak to me as if I weren't aware. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, that would be terrible if I weren't, and I'm like, thank goodness they at least started the conversation that way. They would always lead with, you realize this is not your fault. And it's like, oh, wow. Yes, I do. I can't imagine thinking that it were.
Right.
And being very grateful, that I had never had that thought truly. I mean, we all, I think it crosses our minds, but to truly know that it wasn't that cup of coffee that I had.
Right.
It was not, my walk.
That's encouraging that was just the experience you had in the hospital.
Yeah, definitely.
What are there any sort of final thoughts you would say for people who maybe have just recently had a first loss?
Yeah, I mean, I know we all handle things differently. That's, as much as it is wonderful to have this open dialogue and all of these open resources, we still are, very individualized. But my advice, honestly, would be to find one or two or three people that are one of your safe people for this, topic, who understand or are a good listening ear, and rely on that support, whether it's your husband, whether it's, a friend, whomever it is. Truly find those people and, rely on the comfort that having that open dialogue can give you, because it's sad, and I don't mean to, but it's going to suck. It just does. There's nothing, there's no resource, there's no, and again, as much as I would be considered, our EPLA poster child for is, having the resources and having information, it still was awful.
It doesn't take away the suffering.
But that community, and again, not suffering it alone is seek out those people. Do not, try to think that you have to do it alone. Even if you have all the resources on the internet, you have the kit, the information, you still need people to support you in it. Yeah.
And it's not a quick healing process, I think, for most people.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
just lean on those people for a long while.
Yes.
I still do.
Yes. Oh yeah. I'm 2 years out, but I kind of feel like I'm about 6 months out. Is quite honestly how I, mentally and emotionally feel. It's strange.
Yeah, well, every year when the date rolls around of when my bleeding started and the loss happened, I mean, it'll be 12 years this year ago. And it's like that date, I sort of dread that date, even though I have 4 kids living. It's like, oh, here comes September 29th,
Oh, yeah. And there's always those dates and they always pop up. And again, people to support you so they know the date, or you can tell them, hey, my date is coming up that I struggle with, you know. Even, I'm sure they have a lot of things to keep track of, but just having someone, to have an open dialogue with.
Yes, there's someone in our family who lost a spouse, and so like not only is that date hard, but then I know like their anniversary is hard, his birthday is hard, right? So and just sort of having that in your mind and reaching out on those days is helpful. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
It's hard to share sometimes, but it's also super beneficial. So
it is. Yes, I have benefited a lot from people sharing their stories.
Oh, good.
So, yes.
Wonderful.
Yes. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.